Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. Rob Hoke. I'm the Training and Learning Mentor for the Northwestern Synod, and we are continuing our conversation about legacies of slavery. I'm joined today by Professor Anthony G. Reddie. Anthony is the director of the Oxford Center for Religion and Culture in Regent's Park College in the University of Oxford. He is also an extraordinary professor of theological ethics and research fellow with the University of South Africa. He is the first Black person to get an A rating in theology and religious studies in the South African National Research Foundation. This designation means that he is a leading international researcher. He is a prolific author of books, articles, and chapters in edited books. He is the editor of Black Theology, an international journal. He is a recipient of the Archbishop of Canterbury's 2020 Lambeth Lafranc Award for Education and Scholarship, given for exceptional and sustained contribution to Black theology in Britain and beyond. He is also the author of Theologizing Brexit, a liberationist and post-colonial critique, published in 2019, and he is no stranger to the Northwestern Synod, who you joined us back in October. It seems like it was yesterday, but welcome back again, Anthony. It's good to have you here today.
It's great to be with you. It really is.
Thank you for being with us. So we're going to talk about legacies of slavery, and we're talking about how we move people from a place of kind of paralysis and fear to a place of change and rearticulation of what it means to be a human being created in God's image, who happens also to be white. So that's kind of the thinking around today's conversation. And I think maybe one of the ways we could visit, just to initiate the conversation, is if you could talk a little bit about triggers that people might experience, that we might need to acknowledge in these kinds of conversation, triggers that might disable or interrupt a meaningful engagement with the issues.
So, yeah. Well, I think one of the key difficulties in having these conversations is about how we talk about and engage with the phenomena of whiteness. That because for the most part, most people who are racialized as white don't talk about it, don't think about it. It's not something that is ever a part of their consciousness. That when you then mention that as something that we need to wrestle with, to rethink, to deconstruct, people's initial reaction is either it's either anger or defensiveness. So anger in the sense in which, why are you making me think about something I've never had to think about before? Why do I have to talk about being white? Why is that a thing? So there's anger. Or there's a kind of defensiveness that says, well, I didn't get a choice to be born white. It's just who I am. It's what, and now you're telling me I'm a problem. And I'm always at pains to say there's a difference between thinking about white people and thinking about a phenomena that gives rise to a system and practices and structures and ways of being that impact upon all of us, but clearly give an advantage to what it is to be white. So then someone comes back and says, but I'm not conscious of any advantage of being white, I mean, like, you're just kind of trying to make me feel guilty, of which my obvious riposte is, well, so the fact that you don't have to think about it is actually one of the entitlements that you have. So the fact that you can go about your life and just say, I'm just a human being, which actually is what all of us want to be. All of us want to be, I'm just a human being. That the skin I'm in, that the ways in which people label me or how people might see me, those are not the real me. There's a core me, there's a very integral me that God has created in God's image and likeness, that is to be loved and affirmed and supported and encouraged. All those things that we want for ourselves, that white people can assume, non-white people can't assume that. All of us have to think about what it is to be Black, even not to think about it is to make the decision not to think about it. So, you know, I mean, so I have friends and cousins who are not as radical or as politicized as I am, and they would say, I'm trying to transcend. I don't want to think about this body I made and what it represents. I just want to be. But most white people take that for granted already. So already that's your entitlement, not even have to wrestle with it, not even have to think. But actually, in this situation, how is someone going to see me? People might think that in terms of gender, or in terms of class, in terms of sexuality. So it's not to say people don't think about it, but they don't think about it in terms of being white. That's the key thing.
Very, very good. Thank you. That's very helpful. I'm gonna just jump into your book a little bit, of Theologizing Brexit. You share stories often, and one of the stories you share in Theologizing Brexit is from when you were a young adolescent man, 16 years old, very fragile age, things are going on, and you say that you were marked out, and I'm quoting here, not like the other Black boys. You were seen as different, especially in that you were introverted, studious, ambitious, and gifted. And now quoting still, because my personality conformed to the ideal, passive, non-threatening construction of Blackness that has always been the preferred archetype of colonial mission Christianity, I was encouraged and supported, often held up as a role model to my seemingly more recalcitrant Black male peers. And then you go on to say, I was guilty of believing the hype. Can you tell us what happened that made you begin to question the hype? How did you come to see your difference through the prism of a Black liberation theology rather than the preferred archetype of colonial mission Christianity?
Yeah, well, that really did not come until a number of years later when I was at university. And then perhaps, if I'm honest with you, maybe even post-university. So at this point, I'd be kind of mid-20s, so probably about 7 or 8 years older than that particular story I was told. And by that point, I had become a community worker. So I was working in Handsworth and Lascelles, so now on the north side of Birmingham. And they are predominantly still are poorer socioeconomic areas, deprivation, no school attainment, poor housing, high unemployment, and a significant significant African Caribbean community there. And when I began to work with those communities as a community worker, as a newly minted graduate from the University of Birmingham, I think what I began to think of is rather than think of myself as some type of unique, distinct individual, I began to see things in more systemic. And I saw that certainly in some of the youth work I was doing, I saw younger examples of myself. I saw young people who were, well, young men who were also kind of studious, not particularly macho, not particularly good at sport, quite nerdy, and good at school. So obviously I recognized myself with them. But now, having kind of grown up a little bit and kind of got into my 20s, but also I think crucially began to see beyond just my own lived experience and began to see things in a much broader context. I could see that how the teachers were offering preferment on these boys, which was very similar to how they had done me and treated me. So they treat me really well. But in treating me really well, it was obvious that they were not treating all the other Black boys as well. So it was this clear distinction between, so you're a good boy and I like you, but you're not like these other boys who are terrible and they're naughty and they talk back and they are recalcitrant and they're challenging. So it was this sort of clear kind of binary, which at the time when I was younger, I both enjoyed. You know, I mean, I was a teacher's pet and I liked it. I was hard work, you know, I mean, I liked when I was praised. But I was also aware that it was created a critical distance from me and my peers. So my peers did not like it. And the older I got, the more I could see that they had good reason not to like me because I was just an annoying, I guess, that goody two shoes, basically. You know, I mean, there's one moment which I nearly put in the book. I did put a book, but I thought, no, it's probably just a little too embarrassing, but I'll say it now. So there's one point I remember, like we were in class. I can't remember what the class was, and some of my peers had got the teacher talking. So because like she loved to tell stories of growing up when she was a hippie in the '60s and whatever. So they got her talking to the point whereby when the bell rang at the end of class had come, which is what they had orchestrated, they did it on purpose so that she would not set us homework. So as we're leaving, Mr. Goody Two Shoes now says, "But miss, like you haven't given us homework." I want to do because all my peers are looking at me like dang John thinking, you stupid. Bleep, 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 bleep. We almost got away with it, but no, I wanted homework. So I remind her, like she pulls the class back in, holds us back for a few minutes while she gives us the homework that the class had almost escaped, except for stupid boy here decides that, So you can imagine what happens next. Basically, I think I pleaded my innocence, and I think that probably saved me from getting a kicking. But I probably deserved a kicking, quite frankly, because I was just an annoying person. Now, all that to say that what I realized was that when you put this into a larger scale, what you realize is that during slavery and colonialism, empire always had a good way of being able to divide and rule between those who they would see as being their apparatchiks, the ones who they could treat as acolytes. They would treat them well. So on slave plantations, like you have house Negroes and field Negroes, and those who were given slightly more preferment, given slightly more encouragement, given a little bit more sense of leeway and comparative freedom in return for being docile, passive, accepting, hardworking, who would not question authority. And then those who were seen as the other, seen as problematic, seen as dangerous, seen as willful, seen as people who you would not trust. And so when I got older, I realized that although, yes, they were treating me well, or they treat me better than my peers, we were all still racialized within a particular framework. So I was acceptable because I was so passive and so accepted. So, so although the teacher said nice things about me and they treat me well, and I'm very grateful for that, there was also a way in which I wasn't given a lot of freedom to be myself. So I remember on a couple of occasions getting really angry, quite right, for something that happened. And the teacher looked at me thinking, but Anthony, I thought that like you were better than that. And it's like, oh, I see. So I have to be saintly like now, simply for you to accept me as a human being. So I can't even get angry when I'm just about to get angry because my whole persona is someone who is so supine and is so passive and is so, I guess, has had any sense of righteous anger or indignation taken from them. That the only way which I can behave is effectively to be almost like a mannequin. So I could see that was problematic, but not at the time, only when I was older and could put that binary between me being well behaved and the other boys being somehow dangerous and transgressive. I could put that into a larger systemic and historic framework.
You're speaking now, and it reminds me of a line in that same section where you name this this intelligence, this ambition, this quality of character housed in a Black body. And it seems to me that what you're doing is really kind of, exploring how those have been made into a binary, such that you can't even be angry as a human being about understandably unjust circumstances or unjust views being foisted on you. I think this is really powerful. I want to. You just said you tell stories from your life as a Black human being, and white theologians often don't tell their stories, much less that they're white. So you can read an entire volume and never know that this person has a particular complexion. What's that about, do you think? What is that? What's going on
Yeah,
there?
yeah. Well, yeah. That's huge, and people literally do PhDs on this stuff. So in brief, I think it's a number of things really. I think one is it's this conceit we have created an intellectual framing of knowledge that somehow there's a gap between, or no relationship between the person doing theology and the theology that they're doing. That somehow what we're doing is some objective, universal. Um, how they how do they used to describe theology? The queen of the sciences. It's
Yeah.
this rational um, study of the being and nature of God that somehow has, yeah, as I said, really has like no relationship to the speaker at all. And whilst I think that's been true for a long time, I think it particularly becomes quite evident when you get people theologizing through the era of Christendom, theologizing through the era in which what's at stake really are major socio-political and economic and cultural matters, but they're not framed as such, but they are important because, if you're thinking, let's say, for example, pre-enlightenment, where the fundamental truth is the truth that comes from God, that this sense in which, like, the hierarchy of and how nature has created us is an expression of God's self, then who we determine God to be then helps them to determine what is truth, what is normative, and how we should behave, and how we should treat others. So once you have empire, and empire is fundamentally, certainly in the West, predicated on whiteness, but whiteness that never speaks of itself as such. It never names itself as such. Then, of course, there's no need to make it visible. There's no need to talk about it because it's just the assumed backdrop against everything we are doing in terms of what is to be human. So the ideal human is a European of white skin who then goes out to conquer the world and to civilize everyone else who's not white. And God gets colluded within that. So the minute you begin to have to talk about whiteness is that you then have to then talk about the project that you are doing that deep down, is actually unethical, but you want to convince yourself not only that it's ethical, but that God blesses it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So therefore, there's never been any advantage to white people making whiteness visible. On the contrary, the more it's invisible, the more you can convince everyone that what you're doing is of God. God blesses it. It's a reflection of God's self. It's a way of describing and ordering the world along the precepts of God, untroubled by this thing called whiteness that is what is framing everything that's been done. So, for example, I got into an argument the other day, which one of those pointless. I say pointless because nothing I was ever going to say was ever going to dissuade this person from their particular ideal. So there's a major book that's come out from an Oxford academic, a guy called Nigel Bigger, and the book is about civilized. No, sorry. The book is about colonialism. It's called A Moral Reckoning, and essentially says colonialism is a good thing. That the British Empire was benign, it wasn't particularly violent, it was a force for good. Clearly, I disagree with that completely. So, anyways, this person writes to me and says, what do you think about the book? I say, well, not a great deal. I mean, that's me being polite. I'm not going to say a lot more about it, but we'll just keep it as, it's not, I'm not a great fan. I said, and the reason I'm not a great fan is that right at the heart, I said, is this particular presumption of whiteness that says that it sounds like you can go to someone's country uninvited, conquer them. Yes, you may well do good things for them. You may well bring about some notion of civilization, like you may bring some development, bring hospitals and schools and railways and medicine. You may even stop unjust practices that they themselves have been doing. But all that is on the assumption that you have the right to invade their country and take away their agency in the first place. I simply said, you could never reverse that polarity. Imagine if black and brown people had tried to invade white people's countries. I said, imagine if some aliens came from outer space and they came and they brought the kind of technology that would transform our lives exponentially better by a factor of 10. No one would accept it because the basic premise would be you had no right to come and invade us in the first place. Yes, okay. Yes, even if our practices are wrong and they're barbaric, there are practices and there are traditions. If we want to change them, then we should change them ourselves because we choose to do so, not because you came to impose it upon us. I said that in the email. He replies and effectively ignores everything I've just said and says, oh, yes, but, but the British ended sati in India and you have to accept that, of course, like there was wrong on both sides and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, you just don't get it. You just cannot understand how much everything what you've just said is on the presumption that what white people can do to others, others could never do to you. And that assumption is that somehow God's caught up in that and that justifies it. This person would say he's not right-wing, he's not particularly anti, he's a reasonable, generous person who thinks that he and I should be friends. And yet his response is so encoded in white privilege that he can't see it.
It's invisible. He doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just it's just not visible. So one of the things I've often said about Black theology, it does two things really. Actually, coming right back from Cohen. First thing it does, obviously, is to affirm blackness. It's to affirm all that that's been demonized and being seen as being bestial or being seen as being benighted or not of God or something that to be pitied. So God is revealed in Black suffering. God is revealed in Black experience. But the second crucial thing that Black theology does is to make whiteness own up to being white. It's to make whiteness visible. It's equivalent of sort of pointing out the shadow. It's like you point a light at something and it then creates a shadow. And it creates the shadow that you can then see the thing that you couldn't see before. To say, actually, this is whiteness. This is what it looks like. These are the presumptions that underpin it. This is what enables a theologian writing it in their little location to write books that then speak for everybody across all space and time, and to define people they've never met, lands they've never situated themselves in, to dismiss all their spiritualities and all their indigenous thinking because you know better and your theology is the last word. That is the epitome of whiteness and supremacy in terms of an attempt to control God, but to control everyone else and to control knowledge.
Well, there's another narrative you share. You're sitting in a church meeting and it's going on and on as meetings do. They're talking about perhaps the decline of the church or moments of growth. And then it turns to asylum. And all of a sudden, everybody turns to you. And suddenly you're visible. But for the previous part of the conversation, not there, not present, or invisible. Is it kind of the gist of what you're saying? It happens in the church, not necessarily in the theological tomes, but in the life of the church.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it's this thing about being seen and not being seen. And being seen and not being seen is because of how whiteness operates. So at one level, as I said, in that particular story, if I'm right, I'm literally the only Black person in the room. So everyone else in the room is white. But no one ever noticed that because that was just people. It's normative that virtually everyone in the room should be white. And there's only one person who's not white, but that's never acknowledged. Until suddenly there's a subject that is quote unquote a Black subject. And at which point then suddenly I become visible because suddenly this issue is not about them. Everything that's generic is white. So we talk about church growth, it's really about white people. Talk about church history, well, of course, that's really white church history. We're talking about theology, that is not usually James Cone or contextual theologians, it's Karl Barth or Tilly Cone or Luther or Calvin and etc., etc. Only when it becomes a subject which clearly has a marked element to it. So asylum seekers, interesting enough, with the exception, of course, of the Ukraine, and it's interesting how different we have treated Ukrainian asylum seekers because they're still part of Europe. So suddenly now, I mean, the Sun, one of the most right-wing forms of agitprops for years that's been demonizing asylum seekers, suddenly now had its headline, well, I mean, let's welcome Ukrainians. Well, we weren't welcoming Afghanistanians like that, people from Afghan like that. We weren't welcoming people from Iraq, but suddenly, so it's this way in which whiteness is invisible and therefore is generic. But if a subject comes up that we can see specifically has relationships to people who we see as other, not one of us, then suddenly that's when the only other person in the room who is other, me, suddenly it's like, oh, Anthony, so tell us all about your concerns about asylum and immigration. Like that's not a concern for all of us.
In other words, it reinscribes this kind of othering ideology of whiteness. We don't see it, but it flashes. Because we asked the one Black person in the room about a Black topic, so-called, therefore the white church says it is an inclusive church. Is that?
Yeah, indeed, yeah.
This kind of leads into we've been working around the edges of it anyway, but there's a quote that I like. We don't know who discovered water, but we can be pretty sure it wasn't a fish. And what we're talking about is really discovering that there is a phenomenon called whiteness. And you claim and really urge that Black liberation theology can help white people rethink and re-articulate whiteness. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So one of the key things I honestly believe as a Christian theologian is that this construct of race that doesn't exist, that all of us are more alike than unalike. So there's no such thing as, let's say, white blood and black blood. There's no, but I mean, what most scholars will say is that the only fundamental differences is skin, but that's about environment. Basically, if you're born in the tropics, like you need more melanin so your skin doesn't burn. That's the sum total of what black skin represents. It doesn't represent anything else. There's no magic properties in it. There's no curse in it. It's simply a reaction to biology and evolution in terms of where you live. And then eye color, in terms of mostly, I'm less likely to have blue eyes because of my genetics. Those are the only really two kind of genetic markers. Everything else, where 99% whatever, pretty much kind of linked in terms of DNA. But yet think of how the world has been constructed on that fallacy. It's a fallacy. But then think about how policies have been enacted, how systems and structures have been worked, how policies and procedures have been created on the basis of this falsehood. And so although the falsehood primarily disadvantages people of color, people of the global majority heritage, the truth is it also disadvantages white people as well. Because if whiteness can only function on the basis of being superior, it can only function on the basis of being different, being separated from others. The whole language of purity, think about how often, for example, in many parts of the colonies, people were forbidden to have sexual relationships or have any kind of intimate relationships across lines of racial difference because of the need to maintain purity. You know how much energy it takes to police all of that. And think about all the deep-seated anxiety that then provokes around what it is to be a white human being. So even though there are advantages for white people coming from race, there are huge amounts of disadvantage that comes from the insecurity of having to try and maintain what is a fiction. So what Black theology tries to do is to say that one of the things that I have learned through Black theology is how complex it is to be Black. That whatever the stereotypes that have been thrown at me, if they're true, they're only a partial truth. And most times, they're not even true at all. That there is a complexity to what it is to be a Black human being that, quite frankly, Black theology is still wrestling with in terms of all its myriad facets. Yet, for the most part, because whiteness has been unexplored, it remains as mythical as blackness does, but on the other side of the coin. So think of the presumption that one has to be better than everybody else. I mean, that, like I said, think of all the emotional and psychological energy it takes to believe that you have to be superior to someone else. Not just equal, not to cohabit, not to share, but to believe oneself to be superior. I mean, that's huge.
Yeah.
But also think at a micro level, think of all the distortions that it then leads to when you cannot be honest with yourself because you can't stare whiteness in the face and acknowledge how that has shaped even individual lives. Let me give one quick example, which obviously I talk about in the Brexit book. The fact that white working class people were convinced to vote for Brexit and to vote on the basis that, I mean, even as I say this, I'm struggling to keep a straight face because it's so ridiculous that somehow posh, rich, white people like Boris Johnson and Gove and Nigel Farage, just the very idea that they cared even 1 ounce about poor, marginalised, disaffected, working class people because they're both white. It's utter nonsense. Yeah, people believed it, and they believed it because what they'd been sucked into is this myth of whiteness. So they have to account for why they're poor, marginalised. So it can be one of three things. It can be your own individual moral failings, which, funny enough, on different occasions, these same white people will tell you. These same white people, I mean, Boris Johnson's been on record as saying negative things about poor working class people, particularly from the north, especially the city of Liverpool, where in that city, they still refuse to buy the Sun newspaper because the Sun newspaper not only demonized like the Liverpool fans during the so-called Hillsborough disaster, but they were also, it's the same newspaper that carried negative comments that Boris Johnson made about this city that loves to glorify in its own suffering, and they are the architects of their own demise. So here's a guy who's despised them in the past, yet now turns up as their champion, and they choose to believe it. Yeah. So here's the thing. So it's either your own moral failings, or this is a system that has been built up to demonize and to marginalize you. It's built on neoliberal economic principles that has never cared about supporting the poor people, but has always been about having low taxes and supporting the rich and the comfortable. Or thirdly, it's neither of the first two. It's all these immigrants and all these black people and brown people who come and taking your jobs, and that's why you're poor. Now, that third one only works if you've already been conditioned to think in terms of whiteness as a form of superiority. Because if you assume that as a white person you deserve better than black and brown people who come from other parts of the world, often coming from the empire that you have helped to create. But if you still have a presumption that you deserve better and you're not getting better, then of course it's easier than like for a white English nationalist to turn up and stir you up and say, well, of course, your problem is it's not that we've overseen a system that oppresses you. It's not that you may have made bad moral failings. Not that I want to go down that road because I don't believe in those arguments. But fundamentally, it's because you are being pitted against these other people who are taking the resources that should go for you. The only way you can understand that type of internalized misdirection is to understand how whiteness then still functions as a form of identity politics, whilst at the same time demonizing everyone else for having identity politics, but not recognizing whiteness is the biggest set of identity politics we have in our country, because poor white people never see themselves as being in alliance largely with other people who are poor. They see themselves somehow being in partnership with rich people who have never cared about.
You talk in another place about kind of a schizoid theology or psychotheology that splits us as human beings. And it seems like that's what you're naming here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so in effect, then, Black Liberation Theology is a theology of healing. It comes by way of challenge, but it is a gospel of healing.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because I think what Black theologians have been trying to do, and actually it's only been literally the last 5, 10 years that you've seen it happening, firstly in America, now more so in Britain, which is white people are looking critically at whiteness and are deconstructing it. What they're saying is, okay, like the things that we can be proud of, the things that we can hold on to, because they're about humanitarianism, they can be about sharing, they can be, and there are lots of examples where Britain at its best has been a place of inclusivity, a place of tolerance, although tolerance is limited, and I want people to go beyond tolerance, but that's better than let's say hostility, of course.
Sure.
So there are examples that you can point to and say, actually, this is Britain at its best. But at the same time, there are lots of things that you have to point to and say, yeah, but this is it at its worst. And how then do we then critique and rethink that? There's a great quote that comes from James Baldwin, who's kind of one of the architects of Black theology, according to Kahn. So Kahn says there's three people who create, helped to create Black theology. The Black in Black theology comes from Malcolm X in terms of Black nationalism. That's the pride of being Black, thinking about being Black as a positive symbol, as a positive experience. The theology bit, it says, come from Martin Luther King, who still believes in the redemptive power of the Christian story. People can be changed. People can be better than they are. He believes in integration, thinks that white people can be different. But then James Baldwin, he says, he provides a style. So the style of the writing that is direct, but never over fussy. I hope that my books are readable, that people can say, actually, I can see what Anthony's saying. And actually, part of telling the story is that, and it's something that a few people have picked up on. So long before I got into Black theology, I want to be a playwright. I want to be a storyteller, a novelist. That was never quite happened. And James Baldwin was one of my heroes. So Baldwin provides a style. So Baldwin has this great quote where he says, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And so Black theology has been about trying to get white people to face whiteness and to face the dangers of white supremacy and deconstruct it, not in order to stop being white, because obviously a white person racialized as white can be no less white than I can be any less Black, but to say, how then do we then hold on to the best of and wrestle with and try to discard the worst of?
This is really zeroing in on the tension between what you call fixed identities and achieving the complex subjectivity of human experience. And if you could briefly define those and why they're important, and maybe I think we've kind of named the problem with the fixed identity, but why should we desire that complex subjectivity?
Yeah, sure.
And then maybe how we can, how do we get there?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so so it's important because it's just fundamentally true that all of us are very complex subjects. We are more than any simple descriptor that anyone could use in order to say who we are. So if I said, so who are you, Rob? And you can say, I am blah, 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 blah. And you can give some basic descriptors to who you are, where you're from, where you were born, who your parents were, how old you are, what your sexuality is, etc., etc. All those would give me a sense of who you are. But there's a sense in which, no matter how many questions I ask, would I ever really get to the essence of who is Rob Hodge? Would I ever get? I doubt I would, because there's something deeply, powerfully complex about us. And I say we're complex because if we're created in the image and likeness of God, and think of how complex God is, then we were never created to be simple. So all that to say that we are more than any stereotype. We are more than any broad ways of trying to describe human beings. And so the danger, actually, is not the danger, I think the sin of fixed identity is where you try to impose on people a limited set of perspectives as if that's all they are, when actually they are far more than all of that. So complex subjectivity is the freedom to be fully human, even to the point of being contradictory, even to the point of saying, oh, actually, I can think of this one moment and then think of this in another moment. And you can say, but those two things do not make sense. And you say, I know they don't, but I hold them in tension anyway because I'm a human being. That's the power of our imagination. And so what I try to often, and I think I've done it in two places in slightly different ways. In Theologizing Brexit, there's a slightly more technically academic exercise I do with statements and I am statements, but then preceding it and then post and then after Theologizing Brexit, there's two versions of Is God Colorblind, which is a more accessible. That probably of the two probably has the better exercise, although the better theological explanation comes from the Brexit book. It's just a bigger book. It's just got more things in it. But in the exercise in Is God Colorblind, I have the exercise where I get people to think of themselves as standing in the middle of a series of concentric circles. What I often say to people is that if you imagine that as a three-dimensional thing, so imagine that everyone was going around as if like we were a human version of Saturn. So, it's like we're in the middle and we've got a series of concentric circles around us. And in the concentric circles are lots of little orbiting entities, each one with a name on. So one might be, I am a male, I am black, I'm a socialist, that's my case. I'm a Methodist, in your case, I'm a reformed, I'm a minister, So all those things that we are, like they're all floating around us in orbit, in those circles around us. And so what I say to people, I said, imagine that every time you meet another human being, they have as many circles with as many varying elements to it as you do. So if when you meet, it's not just two human beings meeting, it's two complex subjects that are both carrying multiple, a plethora of, so in some cases, almost an indefinable number of elements that make up who they are. Even sometimes like there can be things that can be totally imagined. So when I do the exercise, I sometimes run the joke that says, well, I could put down that I'm a budding Hollywood star. So, so obviously here I am slapping it with everyone as a theologian, but in my mind, I'm really like the next Chris Rock. I'm the next funny guy who should be in an arena with tens of thousands of people clapping and adoring him because I'm just a wonderfully funny guy. But here's the thing, I said, I can be utterly deluded in that idea, but the very fact that I can imagine it means I can put that down as one of my circles, even though it has no basis in fact whatsoever. But that's the power of our imagination. It's also part of our sinful condition, is that like we can imagine things about ourselves that are simply not true. But that's what it is to be complex. And therefore, what we try to do, this is how I interpret when it says in scripture, love your neighbor as yourself, is to give to your neighbor all the attributes of what it is to be complex that you would want to believe about yourself.
That's beautiful. I wish we could talk all day. I know you're not going to give me all day, but but I do want to have one more question with you.
Sure.
So these circle exercises, the concentric circle exercises, the I am statement, these are performative actions within a defined learning environment. Why performative? Why don't we just read a book? Why I mean, a book is a good thing, of course, but
sure. Yes, and we can, but I think it's important to read, but there's a limited value in terms of the reading is good in terms of simply acquiring knowledge. If you read a book, like you can just know something, that's really great. But I think there's a difference between that and a form of learning that is effective. And by that, I mean that it becomes internalized in you, becomes part of who you are. So it's not just something that you can recognize with your brains. It's something that then has an impact upon the whole of your being. And that's when the performative element comes in. So when we do something with others and we are in the shared exercise, and what all the exercises do take the one with the concentric circle or the other version with the strips. They show variety. That even though it's a common exercise, no two people ever do it the same way. So even I've done it with twins in the room, and the twins are being very different. So they're different things. And what that then shows, it shows this brilliant tension that we've always had in human beings. That at one level we are more alike than unalike. That we share attributes, and we are so individuals that even Scripture says that God knows the very hairs on our head. Obviously, God didn't have much to count in either your case or my case, but but obviously there is something of the individual nature of who we are that is held in tension alongside our collective identity as being human beings, created in the image and likeness of God. And I think the tension that the Christian faith has always faced and the church has always faced is when do we emphasize those things that are common in terms of our common heritage? Then we can say, actually, all of us are more alike than unalike, and we want to affirm our sameness. But in what ways then do we also say, yes, but even as we're saying that, what we also need to acknowledge is our individualities, the fact that we are all unique, we're distinct. So when you fill in that exercise, no one else will ever fill it in exactly how you fill it in. And even if they have similar things in similar places, when you then ask people, so why have you put down being a father, for example? You'll find that two fathers are never the same, two mothers are never the same, two daughters or two sons are never the same. If you put down, for my case, I come from West Yorkshire. That is not the same as someone else coming from Yorkshire, and how they feel about it and how you interpret it are not the same things. So there's something about those exercises that give us a way of digging into ourselves, but also an insight into the interior of other people's lives. And that shared exercise and that shared moment, I have seen it myself, can be hugely powerful in terms of how we then build empathy, because I think that's the key thing in the end. That what I'm trying to do with the work is not to make us adversaries, it's to make us fellow sojourners, make us disciples, make us people who are committed to each other through our shared connection with God.
And this is kind of what you see as was hope-giving, life-giving in all of these conversations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Anthony. This has been a real gift of the spirit and mind and body. Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure to sit down with you again and to hear your voice and to hear your stories, and thank you for the gift that you bring to the church. And I can't wait till we meet again. All right. Thank you so much, Anthony.
It is. Well, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.